Last week, a federal appeals court stopped the frisk, stop and frisk. That's right. The court blocked the sweeping changes to the NYPD's race-based law enforcement program that was implemented back in August. Citing Judge Shenlin's poor conduct and lack of impartiality, the court decided her ruling was completely invalid and removed her from the case. So, what does this mean for the future of stop and frisk and the NYPD's racist surveillance techniques? To answer that question, I was joined earlier by Rutgers University professor Kumar, who writes extensively about race issues. I started by asking her whether she thinks larger forces were at play behind the recent ruling.
I think this was basically the establishment trying to push back against a judge that did the right thing. I mean, she took the facts into consideration, which is, and you know, these facts are well known, that first of all, Black and Latino young men are disproportionately targeted by stop and frisk. And two, that over 90% of people who are targeted are in fact innocent. They don't even have small quantities of marijuana on them. And so what she did is she said, look, this is a violation of Fourth Amendment's rights, which is the ability for Americans to not be searched unless there is reasonable grounds. And so she came out with what I thought was the right thing to do. But of course, the establishment doesn't like that and wants to push back against this and in fact reassign the case to another judge.
And of course, New York's mayoral candidate, Bill de Blasio, is expected to win today, has promised to dismantle stop and frisk. However, given the recent ruling, do you think that he'll even have the power to do so?
It's hard to say, really. I mean, you know, there are ways in which if politicians want to, they can take the lead in actually stopping laws like this. But I'm really not holding my breath on this because, you know, Bill de Blasio used to be an aide to Bill Clinton back when he was president. And as we know, Bill Clinton actually introduced the omnibus crime bill, expanded the uses for which the death penalty can be put. One of the first things he did is flew back to Arkansas to preside over the execution of a mentally retarded Black man. So I'm not so sure, even though de Blasio has actually run a really good campaign around stop and frisk, which is a wonderful shift from the previous Democratic mayoral candidates who, you know, frankly, alienated Black and Latino voters in New York. He has actually run a refreshing campaign around speaking out around stop and frisk, but I'm not holding my breath that he's actually going to dismantle the program.
Good point. It could be just empty rhetoric just to get votes there. Let's take a look at his opponent, the campaign ad for New York Republican mayoral candidate Joe Lhota.
Bill de Blasio's recklessly dangerous agenda on crime will take us back to this. Don't let Bill de Blasio take New York backwards.
All right, so he's not specifically referencing stop and frisk, but it's pretty clear that the ad's alluding to the practice. How does this type of fear-mongering play into the larger problem here?
Right. I mean, let's be clear. Activists, people from the ACLU, and all sorts of people. You know, last year in June, over 10,000 New Yorkers actually held a silent march against stop and frisk, and they've put centrally in this issue the idea of racism and how the NYPD systematically uses racism. Just very quickly, you know, when this, during the trial, two NYPD police officers who are whistleblowers brought recordings in where they showed that their supervisors, for instance, this one officer in the Bronx, actually was told that he's not targeting enough of the right people at the right time and the right places, right? This is recorded. And when asked who that is, he says, you know, Black kids ages 14 to 20, 21. So we know that racism is very central to the way in which stop and frisk is carried out. And part of what Joe Lhota has done is to push back against Bill de Blasio's sort of opposition to stop and frisk by this kind of fear-mongering. This is not the first time we've seen this kind of ad. This is a long strategy that used to be referred to as the Southern strategy that the Republicans developed developed in the post-civil rights era, when you could no longer be, sort of blatantly racist against African American. And so being tough on crime became a way in which to appeal to white voters in the South to say, look, your rights will be guaranteed, and these black people, particularly black men, will be locked up and put away. And that's what you see in this ad, really. There isn't a black figure as such, but there's this sort of apocalyptic sense of this is what will happen. We'll go back to the bad old days where African Americans were actually political agents fighting for their rights and so forth.
Right, right. And, of course, it's not just this institutionalized racism. It's also the spying. We know that the NYPD actually reached over their jurisdiction and was spying on Muslim communities in New Jersey. This summer, the ACLU sued the NYPD over its spying program, but the city says the program doesn't even exist. I mean, if the NYPD won't even admit to this program existing, how can we expect real reform to come out of this lawsuit?
Absolutely. The reason why we know that it exists, Abby, is because the Associated Press actually did some really good investigative reporting and broke the story back in 2011, 2012 about what the NYPD called a human mapping program, where they systematically targeted not just mosques, but community centers, bookstores, shops, any place that, Muslim Americans might be, including campuses, my campus at Rutgers University, Yale University, and so on, student groups at these campuses to collect information from them. So we know for a fact that this has been happening. And right now, there is that lawsuit, as you mentioned, that was brought out by the ACLU, the NYCLU, and another group. And it's so fascinating to see the defense that the NYPD is putting up against this kind of systematic racial profiling. If you read their briefs, what they're saying is that a violent act committed by a Muslim anywhere in the world, and keep in mind there are 1.5 billion Muslims around the world, is grounds enough for them to racially profile or religiously profile Muslims in New York City. So let me repeat that. What they're saying is, because it's almost unbelievable.
It does bear repeating. Go ahead.
This is their legal defense, that an act of violence, this could be a protest in Pakistan or in Egypt or in Syria, a demonstration, let us say, where there's some violence, that happening gives the NYPD grounds to surveil Muslim Americans and to collect their political views. Because, the logic of this is that somehow Muslims are, like the Borg. They have a hive mentality, apparently. And what somebody does, say, halfway around the world gets transmitted. And this is nothing if not the very definition of racism.
Of course, every generation has this stereotypical enemy figure. How do you think that we could break this cycle of intolerance that's repeated in every age?
Well, we have to have, first and foremost, a historical memory, right? That is, we have to understand that if a country, no matter what country, wants to go out to war, it has to target not only the people out there who are seen as threats to us, but the supposed representatives of those people in this country, right? So during the Second World War, for instance, Japanese Americans, particularly after the incident in Pearl Harbor, the Japanese not only become an international enemy in the context of the Second World War, but Japanese Americans get targeted right here in the United States. Over 100,000 are put into concentration camps. And by the way, a vast majority of them were American citizens. Now, of course, an apology was issued under the Reagan administration saying that this was wrong, this was racial profiling and so on. But it's interesting that it's only in the late 80s, after Japan has, pretty much been subsumed under the U.S. umbrella in that region and no longer poses any kind of threat, that an apology can be issued. And it's not a principled anti-racist stand, because at the same time that this apology is issued, Chinese are being presented as an enemy and as a threat. In fact, the neoconservatives have, been since the 1990s talking about the rise of China, and the rhetoric that accompanies it is a very racist sort of anti-Chinese rhetoric. So I think the way to combat this is to have a sense of how the political elite operates, why it is that they can't say, you know, we're off in the Middle East because we would like to control oil in the region, and therefore we're using these racist stereotypes of Arabs, of South Asians, and so on and so forth. They can't say such things. Instead, they rely on these mechanisms of demonization in order to keep people afraid, in order to, you know, win their consent through fear.
Exactly. Amazingly put. Thank you so much for coming on, Deepa Kumar. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you, Abby.